Ronan Nash tightened his grip on the wrench in his calloused hands, his mind racing as the elevator emergency alarm blared through the small maintenance room. This was the last thing he needed today. He had already worked a 10-hour shift, his body aching from hauling equipment up and down the high rise. But when the front desk reported that someone was trapped between floors, he didn't hesitate. "How long has she been in there?" Ronan asked, already heading toward the control panel. "About 10 minutes. She sounded panicked," the security guard replied. Ronan exhaled sharply and pried open the maintenance hatch. The elevator was stuck between the 20th and 21st floors, too high to risk a forced door opening from below. He grabbed his toolkit and took the stairs up 2 floors, forcing open the emergency access panel on the roof of the elevator car. "Hello," his deep voice echoed in the small space. A sharp gasp came from inside. "Oh, thank God, I'm in here." The woman's voice was laced with desperation. "All right, I'm going to get you out. What's your name?" he asked as he carefully lowered himself inside. Juliette Langston," she said, her breath uneven. He landed on the elevator floor and looked up only to find himself face to face with one of the most breathtaking women he'd ever seen. Even in distress, she had an elegance about her. Her dark hair was pulled back into a sleek bun, and she wore a fitted navy dress that screamed money. She clutched her phone in one hand, but there was no reception in the metal box. Ronan didn't have time to dwell on how out of place she seemed compared to the usual office workers he encountered. "Are you hurt?" "No, just," Juliette swallowed, pressing a hand against her chest. "Hate small spaces." The lights flickered, and she shook her head. "I just need to get out of here." Ronan nodded. "All right, I'll get the doors open manually. Stay close to me." She did as he said, standing near him as he worked the emergency release. With a groan of metal, the doors slid open, revealing the narrow gap between the elevator and the floor above. Juliette's eyes widened. "That's a long way up." "I'll boost you through, you trust me." She hesitated, scanning his face. Something in his steady gaze must have reassured her because she nodded. "Okay." Ronan positioned himself beneath her, his hands firm on her waist as he lifted her toward the opening. She grabbed onto the floor above, and with his help, she scrambled through. A moment later, she turned back, reaching a hand toward him. "Come on." He almost laughed. "I weigh twice what you do. I'll take the maintenance ladder." Before she could protest, he hoisted himself up through the hatch and climbed to safety. When he stepped onto solid ground, he found Juliette watching him, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. "Thank you," she said softly. "Just doing my job," Ronan replied, wiping his hands on his worn jeans. Juliette studied him, as if seeing him for the first time. "You work here?" "Yeah, maintenance." He jerked a thumb toward his uniform shirt, though it was grease-stained and a little worse for wear. "You all right now?" She nodded, but her gaze lingered. "Yes, but I'd like to do something to thank you, maybe buy you coffee." Ronan blinked. Women like her didn't offer coffee to guys like him, but he'd be lying if he said he wasn't tempted. Before he could answer, a man in a crisp suit rushed toward Juliette. "MS, Langston, thank goodness you're okay." Ronan frowned. "MS Langston?" The suit turned to him. "You have no idea who you just saved, do you?" Ronan shook his head. Juliette sighed. "Greg, please." The man ignored her. "She's the CEO of Langston Enterprises." Ronan's stomach dropped. The CEO? He had just lifted a billionaire out of an elevator shaft with his bare hands. Juliette met his wide-eyed stare with an amused smile. "Still want that coffee." Ronan had spent his life fixing things: pipes, circuits, broken machinery. But he had no idea how to fix the moment stretching between him and Juliette Langston as the weight of her identity settled between them. The CEO of Langston Enterprises. The revelation hit him like a sudden gust of wind, knocking the breath from his lungs. He had never paid much attention to corporate giants, but even he recognized her name. Her family's business dominated headlines, synonymous with power and wealth. And now, she stood before him in her tailored dress, watching him with something that looked suspiciously like curiosity. "I meant what I said," Juliette spoke, her voice steady despite the murmuring staff around her. "I'd like to buy you coffee." Ronan shifted his weight, glancing briefly at the suited man who had identified her. Greg, from what he had gathered. The guy practically vibrated with disapproval, his eyes flicking between them as if he were watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. "I appreciate the offer," Ronan said, rubbing the back of his neck, "but you don't owe me anything. It's my job to help when things go wrong." Juliette arched a dark brow. "It's not about owing you. Maybe I just want to have a conversation with the man who pulled me out of a very unfortunate situation." Greg cleared his throat. "MS, Langston, you have a meeting with the board in 20 minutes. Juliette exhaled but didn't look away from Ronan. "You always this difficult to thank." "I just don't see the point," Ronan admitted. "We come from different worlds." Something flickered in her gaze, something sharp and unreadable. Then she smiled. "All right, if you won't accept coffee, then at least let me say this: I'm grateful. You didn't have to climb into that elevator, but you did, and I won't forget it." Ronan nodded, unsure what else to say. Greg placed a hand on Juliette's elbow, gently steering her away. "We really should go." Juliette gave Ronan one last look before allowing herself to be led toward the executive elevators. Within seconds, she was gone, swallowed by the polished halls of the high rise. Ronan let out a breath, shaking his head. What the hell had just happened? Later that evening, Ronan stood in the cramped kitchen of his small apartment, watching as his daughter, Sophie, twirled a spaghetti noodle around her fork with exaggerated precision. "So, did you save anyone today?" she asked, her bright hazel eyes glowing with mischief. Ronan chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Actually, yes, got someone out of a stuck elevator." Sophie gasped dramatically, like a superhero. "Something like that." She took a big bite before speaking again. "Was she pretty?" Ronan nearly choked on his water. "What?" Sophie shrugged, completely ignoring his reaction. In stories, the hero always rescues a princess. "She wasn't a princess," Ronan muttered, though, in hindsight, Juliette Langston might as well have been royalty with the way people had hovered around her. Sophie giggled, "But she was pretty, huh?" Ronan sighed, pushing his plate away. "You ask too many questions." "That's because you never give me fun answers." He shook his head, ruffling her hair. "Finish eating." As Sophie focused on her dinner, Ronan's mind drifted back to Juliette. He doubted he'd see her again, but something about her had unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite shake. The next day, Ronan was in the middle of repairing a generator in the basement when his supervisor, Dale, called him over. "You've got a visitor in the lobby." Ronan frowned. "A visitor?" Dale smirked. "A woman looks important." Ronan wiped his hands on a rag, confused but curious. He made his way upstairs, stepping into the sleek lobby of the building. And there she was. Juliette Langston, standing by the front desk, dressed in another elegant ensemble, her hair pulled back with effortless grace. When she spotted him, she smiled. Ronan approached cautiously. "Did the elevator break again?" Juliette laughed. "No, but nice try." He crossed his arms. "Then why are you here?" "To offer you a job." Ronan blinked. "Come again." "I need a new head of facilities for my company, someone who understands how to handle problems before they escalate, someone reliable." She met his gaze. "I want to hire you." Ronan shook his head. "I don't know anything about corporate maintenance." You know how to fix things, Juliette countered. And from what I've gathered, you're damn good at it. He frowned. Why me? Juliette hesitated, then said, because I trust you. Ronan exhaled, unsure how to process any of this. A day ago, she had been a stranger trapped in an elevator. Now, she was offering him a position in her empire. I have a daughter, he said finally. Can't take risks just because someone trusts me. Juliette nodded. Understand, which is why I'm offering a salary that would make it worth your time. Ronan narrowed his eyes. How much? She named the number, and his stomach tightened. It was more than he had ever made in his life. Juliette leaned in slightly. Take the weekend to think about it. And just like that, she walked away, leaving Ronan standing there, his world tilting in a way he never saw coming. Ronan had spent the entire weekend replaying Juliette's offer in his head, weighing the risks against the rewards. He wasn't a man who made impulsive decisions, especially when it came to his daughter's future. But the salary she had offered was life-changing. It meant a better neighborhood, a school with smaller classrooms, and a future where he wouldn't have to count every penny before buying Sophie new shoes. Still, something about stepping into Juliette Langston's world felt like walking into a storm with no shelter. By Monday morning, he had made his choice. Ronan entered the towering glass building of Langston Enterprises, feeling out of place in his usual work boots and denim jacket. The receptionist barely blinked before directing him to the top floor, as if she had been expecting him. When the elevator doors opened, Juliette was already waiting. I was starting to think you'd turn me down, she said, her eyes sweeping over him with an unreadable expression. Ronan stepped forward, his hands shoved in his pockets. You don't seem like the type to make bad business deals. You sure about this? Juliette tilted her head. You think hiring you is a bad deal? I think you're taking a chance on a guy with no corporate experience. She gestured for him to follow her down the hall. I don't care about corporate experience. Care about results, and something tells me you don't back down when things get difficult. Ronan exhaled through his nose. She wasn't wrong. They entered a sleek office with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Juliette leaned against her desk, watching him. So, does this mean you're accepting the job? He nodded. Yeah, but I have conditions. Her lips parted, intrigued. I'm listening. First, I work set hours. No pulling me in at all hours of the night unless the building is on fire. Fair. Second, I need my weekends free. Have responsibilities outside of work. Juliette crossed her arms. Your daughter. Ronan stiffened. How do you know about Sophie? She met his gaze evenly. I did my research. He didn't know whether to be impressed or annoyed, but she wasn't wrong to look into him. Then you know I'm not the kind of guy who plays games. Juliette pushed off the desk, closing the space between them. Neither am I. For a moment, they stood in silence, the air between them charged with something unspoken. Then, Juliette extended her hand. Welcome to Langston Enterprises, Ronan. He took it, her grip firm, her skin smooth against his calloused palm. And just like that, his world shifted again. The first few weeks at Langston Enterprises were unlike anything Ronan had experienced before. He was used to working with his hands, fixing things that were falling apart. Here, the problems were different, logistical, bureaucratic, buried under layers of policies and procedures. But Ronan didn't waste time adapting. He learned fast, cutting through inefficiencies that had been ignored for too long. The staff respected him for it, and even the executives who had originally scoffed at Juliette's unconventional hire couldn't deny the improvements. Juliette, however, remained the biggest enigma of all. She was sharp, decisive, and carried an air of authority that made people sit up straighter when she entered a room. But beneath the polished exterior, Ronan saw glimpses of something else: fatigue, maybe even loneliness. They spent more time together than he expected, their conversations shifting from work to late nights, discussing everything from childhood memories to the burdens of responsibility. One evening, after a particularly long day, Juliette leaned against the rooftop railing of the building, staring at the city lights. Ronan had been closing up when he found her there. "You always stay this late?" he asked, stepping beside her. Juliette sighed, "More often than I should." "Why?" She hesitated, then said, "Because if I stop moving, I might start thinking too much." Ronan studied her profile, the way the glow of the skyline softened the sharp angles of her face. Thinking isn't always a bad thing. Depends on what you're thinking about. He waited, giving her space to decide whether to continue. Finally, she turned to him. "People assume I have everything because I run a billion-dollar company, but the truth is, I inherited a legacy I never asked for. My father built this empire, and when he passed, I had no choice but to step in. I've spent years proving I deserve to be here." Ronan absorbed her words, understanding more about her in that moment than he had in weeks. "Sounds exhausting." Juliette let out a small, humorless laugh. "It is." They stood in silence for a moment before she asked, "What about you? What keeps you up at night?" "Sophie," he admitted, "making sure she never feels like she has to carry the weight of the world before she's ready." Juliette glanced at him, something softening in her expression. "She's lucky to have you." Ronan looked away, the unexpected praise hitting harder than it should have. "You should go home," he said, shifting the conversation. "Get some sleep." She smiled wearily. "You ordering me around now?" "Just a suggestion." Juliette exhaled, then nodded. "All right, but only because you've somehow managed to make sense for once." Ronan watched as she walked away, a strange feeling settling in his chest. Something was changing between them, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he should fight it or let it happen. Ronan wasn't sure when his life had started revolving around Juliette Langston, but it had. It was in the way his mornings began with her brief nod of acknowledgement as he walked into the office, the way their late-night conversations stretched longer each time, and the way she had started showing up at unexpected moments, like when she surprised Sophie with a stack of books after learning how much his daughter loved to read. The walls Ronan had built around himself were sturdy, reinforced by years of hardship. But Juliette had a way of slipping through the cracks, and no matter how much he tried to ignore it, he knew he was falling for her. The problem was, she wasn't just a woman. She was a billionaire, a CEO, someone who didn't belong in his world. And yet, she kept showing up. One evening, after another long day, Ronan was locking up the maintenance wing when Juliette appeared in the doorway. "Come with me," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. He eyed her warily. "Where?" "You'll see." Against his better judgment, he followed her to the underground garage, where a sleek black car waited. The driver opened the door for them, and Juliette slid inside without hesitation. After a moment's hesitation, Ronan joined her. The car moved smoothly onto the road, the city lights flickering past the tinted windows. "You going to tell me where we're headed?" he asked. Juliette glanced at him, something unreadable in her eyes. "You'll like it." Minutes later, the car pulled up to a rooftop restaurant that overlooked the skyline. The air smelled like freshly baked bread and rich spices, the kind of place Ronan had only ever seen in magazines. "Why are we here?" he asked as they stepped inside. Juliette turned to him with a small smile. "Because I wanted to have dinner with you." Ronan wasn't sure what to say to that. They were escorted to a private terrace, where a table was set with flickering candles. The view was breathtaking, the entire city stretched out beneath them like a sea of golden lights. This is a lot of effort for dinner, he said, settling into his chair. Juliette met his gaze. You don't make it easy to get you alone. Ronan exhaled slowly. Juliette. She lifted a hand, stopping him. I know what you're going to say, that we come from different worlds, that this doesn't make sense, but I don't care. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration warring with something deeper. You should. Why? Because this, he gestured between them, isn't practical. Juliette leaned forward slightly, her expression unwavering. You think I built an empire by being practical. Ronan had no answer for that. They ate in comfortable silence, the tension between them thick but unspoken. The candlelight cast a warm glow over Juliette's features, and Ronan found himself memorizing the way the light reflected in her eyes, the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. By the time dessert arrived, he had given up trying to fight it. I don't know how to do this, he admitted finally. Juliette set her glass down. Do what? This, his voice was rough. You and me. I've spent my whole life worrying about survival, about making sure my daughter has everything she needs. I don't have time for happiness. Her words stopped him cold. Juliette reached across the table, her fingers brushing against his. I know what it's like to be responsible for something bigger than yourself, but that doesn't mean you have to live your life without joy. Ronan stared at her, something inside him unraveling. You make it sound easy, he said quietly. It's not, she admitted, but that doesn't mean it's not worth it. For the first time in years, Ronan wasn't sure what to do next. But when Juliette stood, holding out her hand, he took it without hesitation. The night air was cool as they stepped onto the rooftop balcony. The city stretched out before them, endless and full of possibilities. Juliette turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. Tell me you don't feel it. Ronan exhaled sharply. I feel it. Then stop fighting it. There was no more thinking after that. Ronan closed the distance between them, his hand cupping the back of her neck as he kissed her. It wasn't tentative or uncertain, it was raw, full of every unspoken word, every moment of restraint that had built between them. Juliette melted against him, her hands gripping his shoulders as if she had been waiting for this just as much as he had. When they finally pulled apart, she smiled. That wasn't very practical. Ronan let out a low chuckle. Guess I'm learning from the best. For the first time in a long time, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, happiness wasn't out of reach after all. Ronan hadn't imagined his life would change so dramatically in such a short time. He had gone from a man focused solely on survival, on making ends meet for Sophie, to standing at the center of something he couldn't quite define. It had been weeks since that night on the rooftop with Juliette, since the moment he had finally stopped fighting what had been building between them. And yet, things hadn't gotten any easier. If anything, they had only become more complicated. Juliette had made it clear where she stood she wasn't afraid of what they were, wasn't concerned about the glaring differences between their lives. But Ronan couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't sustainable. He had spent years keeping his world small, controlled, predictable. Juliette was nothing if not the opposite of that. And yet, she was everywhere. She had found ways to slip into his life, not just in stolen moments at the office, but outside of it too. When he got home late, there were nights she called, her voice soft with exhaustion, but unwilling to let the day end without hearing his. When he mentioned in passing that Sophie had a school recital coming up, Juliette showed up without hesitation, sitting in the back of the auditorium with quiet pride as Sophie recited her lines on stage. Ronan had wanted to protest, to tell Juliette she didn't need to involve herself in that part of his life, but the truth was, he didn't want her to stop. Still, none of it erased the nagging doubt in the back of his mind. That doubt only grew when he arrived at Langston Enterprises one morning to find Greg waiting for him near the elevators, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "You've got a minute?" Greg asked, his tone polite but firm. Ronan glanced toward Juliette's office, but the blinds were drawn. Whatever this was, she wasn't aware of it. With a slow nod, he followed Greg into one of the smaller conference rooms. The moment the door shut, Greg exhaled through his nose. "I'm going to be direct because I don't see the point in dancing around it." Ronan leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Go ahead." "You and Juliette," Greg's gaze sharpened, "it's not a secret." Ronan stayed silent, waiting. Greg sighed. "I've known Juliette for a long time. I've watched her build this company from the ground up after her father passed, and I've watched her fend off men who wanted to use her for what she has. She's strong, but she's not invincible." Ronan's jaw tightened. "You think I'm using her?" "I don't know what to think." Greg studied him. "But I do know you weren't part of this world before now, and men who weren't raised in it don't always understand what it takes to stay in it." Ronan let out a slow breath, his patience fraying. "You think I don't know that she's out of my league?" Greg's brow lifted slightly, but he said nothing. Ronan pushed off the wall. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't chase after her. She's the one who kept showing up, kept pushing. But I'll tell you something, I don't give a damn about her money or this company. The only thing I care about is her." Greg studied him for a long moment before nodding, as if he had just made up his mind about something. "Then don't break her heart." Before Ronan could respond, Greg walked out, leaving him standing there, fists clenched at his sides. Later that evening, Ronan found himself standing outside Juliette's apartment, the weight of his conversation with Greg still heavy on his mind. He hadn't planned on coming here, but after the day he'd had, he needed to see her. When the door opened, Juliette took one look at him and frowned. "What happened?" Ronan stepped inside, running a hand through his hair. "Greg cornered me today." Juliette's expression darkened. "What did he say?" Ronan hesitated, then sighed. "He's worried about you, about me." She crossed her arms. "Greg is protective, but he doesn't get to decide who I let into my life." "I know that," Ronan said. "But he's right about one thing. Your world is different from mine, and I don't know if I belong in it." Juliette's gaze softened, but there was no hesitation when she spoke. "I don't care about that." Ronan let out a bitter laugh. "Maybe you don't now, but what happens when the press gets wind of this? When they start digging into my past, when they start asking why the CEO of Langston Enterprises is wasting her time with a guy who used to fix broken pipes." Juliette stepped closer, her voice steady. "This isn't a waste of my time." Ronan clenched his jaw, torn between wanting to believe her and the voice in his head that kept telling him this was reckless. Juliette reached for his hands, lacing their fingers together. "I know you're scared, but I need you to trust me when I say that none of that matters to me." Ronan met her eyes, searching for any sign of doubt, but there was none. He exhaled, finally letting himself believe that maybe, just maybe, this could work. Juliette smiled, squeezing his hands. "Now, are you going to kiss me, or do I have to give another dramatic speech?" Ronan let out a breath of laughter before pulling her in, his lips finding hers in a kiss that silenced every doubt, every fear. For the first time in a long time, he let himself believe that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Ronan had never been a man who believed in fate, but standing in Juliette's penthouse, his arms wrapped around her, he wondered if maybe some things were meant to be. The weight of his doubts hadn't disappeared entirely, but they no longer felt insurmountable. She had chosen him, despite the world that told them they didn't belong together. Days turned into weeks, and their lives began to intertwine in ways neither had anticipated. Juliette had always been fiercely independent, but Ronan found himself becoming a steady fixture in her world. He no longer felt like an outsider in the towering glass office of Langston Enterprises. His work as head of facilities had earned him respect, and while he had never cared about corporate approval before, he understood now that it mattered because it mattered to her. Sophie adored Juliette, and to Ronan's surprise, Juliette had taken to his daughter just as easily. She showed up for school events, asked Sophie about her favorite books, and even sat through an animated movie marathon without complaint. It was effortless, natural, as though she had always been part of their lives. One evening, Ronan arrived at Juliette's apartment to find Sophie curled up on the couch, fast asleep, her head resting against Juliette's shoulder. The sight did something to him, something deep and unshakable. Juliette looked up as he approached, her voice quiet. She had a long day. I didn't want to wake her. Ronan crouched down, brushing a stray curl from Sophie's face. She feels safe with you. Juliette hesitated, then whispered, so do I. Ronan met her gaze, his chest tightening. He hadn't been looking for love, hadn't expected it, but it had found him anyway. He wasn't going to let it go. The first crack in their fragile happiness came when Juliette's company hosted its annual gala, an event filled with the city's wealthiest and most influential figures. Ronan had never been comfortable in spaces like this, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and designer suits, but for Juliette, he endured it. Dressed in a tailored black suit Juliette had insisted on getting for him, he stood by her side as she moved through the room with practiced ease. She was stunning in an emerald green gown, her confidence effortless. But not everyone in the room was as welcoming. An older man with salt and pepper hair approached them, his expression polite but assessing. Ronan had seen his kind before, men who measured worth in bank accounts and bloodlines. Juliette greeted him with a warm but distant smile. "Mr. Hawthorne, good to see you." Hawthorne's gaze flickered to Ronan. And this must be the man I've been hearing so much about. Ronan extended his hand. Ronan Nash. Hawthorne shook it, his grip firm. Juliette's quite the visionary. Imagine it must be overwhelming, stepping into her world. Ronan met his gaze evenly. She makes it easy. Hawthorne gave a knowing smile. For now. Juliette's posture stiffened. "Mr. Hawthorne, if you'll excuse us." But the damage had been done. As they moved through the room, Ronan felt the weight of the stares, the barely concealed whispers. He had expected it, but that didn't make it easier. Later that night, as they stood on Juliette's balcony overlooking the city, he finally spoke. "Is this what it's always going to be like?" Juliette turned to him, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" "The looks, the judgment. People waiting for me to fail, waiting for you to realize I don't fit here." She stepped closer, her hands framing his face. "I don't care what they think, Ronan. I care about us." "But they are part of your world." Her grip tightened slightly. "Then let me make something clear. You're part of my world now, too, and I'm not going to let anyone make you feel like you don't deserve to be here." Ronan exhaled slowly. "What if I can't do this forever?" Juliette's gaze softened. "Then we'll figure it out together." And just like that, the doubt faded. Months passed, and life settled into something that felt dangerously close to perfect. Ronan had never been the type to plan grand gestures, but when he realized there was no future he wanted that didn't include Juliette, he knew he had to do it right. So, one evening, he took her back to the rooftop where it had all started. The city stretched out below them, the same view that had once made him question if he belonged. Now, it felt like home. Juliette turned to him, a fond smile on her lips. "What are we doing here?" Ronan took a steadying breath. "I used to think we were too different, that I'd never fit into your world." She reached for his hand. "Ronan." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, cutting her off. Her breath hitched, eyes widening. "I don't care about the differences anymore," he said. "I don't care what anyone thinks. All I know is that I love you, and I don't want another day to go by without making sure you know that." Juliette's eyes glistened as he opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant ring. "Marry me." She let out a shaky laugh, nodding before she even spoke. "Yes." Ronan slid the ring onto her finger, and when he kissed her, it felt like the final piece of his life had finally fallen into place. The wedding was intimate, just close friends and family. Sophie stood proudly as the flower girl, beaming as Juliette walked down the aisle. When Ronan took Juliette's hands in his, he knew there was no turning back. "I never thought I'd find this," he admitted. "But you showed me that love doesn't have to fit into a perfect mold. It just has to be real. And you, Juliette, are the most real thing in my life." Juliette's voice was thick with emotion. "You once told me I made things easy, but the truth is you made love easy. You made me believe in it again." When they kissed, the world faded away. And as Sophie cheered from the front row, Ronan knew that this was their beginning. A life built not on wealth or status, but on love. A love that would last forever.